Thank you so much for this fascinating panel. And also, let me add our thanks from the entire Webbit team to all of you, 100,000 people from all around the world being with us and being part of the discussion on AI architects, global impact, and the desirable futures we're building. Continuing with one of the most important topics of human rights and the convergence of the rights and the technology. What a new world it is. And we know the world is in crisis, so it will not be an easy job for John Aidan Byrne to moderate this and to present the panel. John.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting panel of Global Impact Week. And the topic of our panel discussion is speaking the language of human rights while considering the technological solutions to a world in crisis. So a lot of it will be technology focused and human rights. We've wonderful panelists. Before they get to introduce themselves real quickly, I have a couple of housekeeping items here. Share your thoughts throughout the week and your questions on the hashtag Webbit, W-E-B-I-T, and of course, feel free to utilize for networking purposes the TVS platform. Now, before the panelists just say a few words briefly, we're talking about human rights and technological solutions, and it's obvious that we have these basic comforts and security in our globe today that we, I suppose, take for granted, but they lead to the prosperity and the development that our society has in the face of constant changes and transformation, unprecedented change. And human rights are a big part of what we're going to be addressing. And we're going to be asking some interesting questions about the language of human rights. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, maybe starting with Limor, and then Ruth and Brett could come in.
Thank you. So I'm Limor Shmerling, and I'm the managing director of the Israel Tech Policy Institute, which is a think tank based in Tel Aviv, Israel, that works on exactly these policy issues. So creating a platform for a multi-stakeholder discussion and the development of policy papers on issues that have to do with emerging technologies and human rights, such as privacy, equality, and so on.
Very good. Ruth?
Yeah, hello, Ruth Shaber. I'm an obstetrician, gynecologist, physician, and also the founder and president of the Tara Health Foundation. We are both a philanthropic and investing house where we look at how to use the markets to improve the lives of women and girls.
Brett.
Hi, I'm Brett Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of Access Now. Our mission is to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk. So we sit at the intersection of human rights and new technology and look at how the human rights framework can be moved into the digital environment. So looking at issues around privacy, security, freedom of expression, opinion association, and so on. So thanks for having me.
Very good. Well, let's get this panel up and running. And I want to start with my first questions for Limor. I'm just going to open it up by saying this debate we're seeing on technology's impact on democracy and human rights, interestingly, has intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, due in large part to governmental intervention and measures. You know, how have different countries reacted to this and taken on this, and how have government measures impacted, and what are some of the extremes maybe you have seen? Can you identify some of these areas for us?
Yes, absolutely. It was fascinating, since I think what we've been seeing is firstly an imperative of governments to protect the basic human right to life and to health, and to make sure that public health is managed for the better good of all of us as a community, as humanity. And some of the solutions were from the biomedical area, some were from digital technologies. So for example, data research, the need to access and process and collect and transfer vast amounts of health data in order to be able to do research that will bring us the vaccines. That required also thought of data protection and privacy and issues around collecting all of this sensitive data about people. There was also the use of contact tracing apps. So at the beginning, it was a huge attempt to break the infection chains by creating the schemes of where people were and who they met with, and try and quarantine those who were possibly infected while we don't even know that yet. And there was a use of various applications on smartphones in order to collect this data or to contact people and then send them into quarantine. And this also raised issues of both privacy and data protection, but also other human rights that may be affected by the processing of data. Because if data is processed about me and then I'm receiving a quarantine order to seclude myself, then that inflicts my freedom of movement. At some point in Israel and in other countries where there was unrest and people wanted to demonstrate, and in the United States as well, for other social values and reasons, then the balance between our right to go outside, to exercise our right to demonstrate, and our political rights were in contrast with the requirement to social distance, to go back home. And all of this has created a lot of friction, which can be translated to the various human rights that we wish to protect, but need to be balanced every time we think about these issues. In China, there was something quite radical. There was a use of drones in order to remotely take body temperature of people and be able to decide whether they should stay indoors or they can go outside. So enforcement of quarantine was employing these digital measures. And this is quite extreme and quite intrusive to our human rights. But on the other hand, in order to, and I remind everyone who's listening that especially at the beginning and in the first year, the panic was very, very severe, and the concern was very high, and the vaccine was far, and it was quite urgent to produce safety and public health. So that created a lot of friction.
Do you think some of the measures were too extreme? You alluded to it there. You know, some of the measures we saw during the pandemic on privacy are what we would associate in the past with totalitarian regimes.
So it's always a double-edged sword. It may be perceived as such. I think that the measure should be the proportionality of the measures that we use, and also the end result. So many times I think that when you analyze technology's impact on society, you firstly need to really understand the technology itself. So in some places, contact tracing apps were reliant on cell tower data, which gives you very crude metrics that don't really serve well the requirement for social distancing and for quarantine. So the technology used was not appropriate for the use case that we wanted. So there was a notion that this may be providing better healthcare and better public health, but at the end of the day, the technology itself was not suitable. So it's important to remember that technology is not a silver bullet. It doesn't work always. It's not suitable always. And the moderation and proportionality and the risk assessment are crucial to achieve the right balance.
So a care, caution, and we almost need societal watchdogs to keep monitor all of this. Now, speaking of the future of privacy, facial recognition technologies, privacy and the freedom of expression, can they coexist?
Another challenge that we're facing. So for example, real-time facial recognition to be used in demonstrations by a government can absolutely be used for discrimination against the participants of those demonstrations and be counterproductive to our democratic values and norms. It may also influence people's ability afterwards to get hired, enter universities. The social scoring, which the US and the EU have called recently for a ban over, social scoring, which is practiced in some regions in China, is something that uses facial recognition in connection with people's behavior in their daily lives, and connecting that afterwards, giving them a social score that influences whether they can get hired, enter university, put their kids in a kindergarten of their choice, travel by train or plane. And this is something that the US, the EU, and I myself think should not be a practice in our society. On the other hand, facial recognition may sometimes be used for anti-terror efforts or for law enforcement in places where it really has an added value and a benefit. Again, I think here as well, it's a question of being able to do a preliminary risk assessment and to not move forward before we analyze the case, we analyze the technology, and we are quite certain, or at least have a very high degree of belief that this will be the right solution to the problem. It's not always the right solution, only in some cases, and we can mitigate those risks that we identify ahead of time and then arrive at a point where we can enjoy the benefits and technology and avoid the mishaps.
Yeah, I mean, all this technology has wide-ranging implications. Take, for example, biotechnology and what's known as brain-computer interface, BCI. I mean, for example, should a government or a corporation be allowed to use BCI to enhance, if that's the correct word, the lethal firepower of soldiers? I mean, is that fair game?
That's a really extreme scenario. I'll first maybe start by explaining a little bit how this works. So BCI lets users move remote objects by the power of their thought. So it's something that has been researched and developed in order to mitigate medical conditions and rehabilitative medicine, and is neurologically meant to allow for a translation between our brain activity into an application, a program, a computer that allows us to now, with our thought, maybe fly a drone. And that is something that has been proven in laboratories to be possible, but is quite far from being implemented in a way that we can visualize a robotic soldier. But it is a long-term possibility, which I think we need to stop, make a really hard stop before we get there. These are extreme scenarios that may be quite detrimental to human rights and humanity, which I think we should think very carefully before moving forward with.
So great care again and caution. I mean, are there any other technology innovations that you can bring up that we're not familiar with, or we may be, and that you have some wisdom on and you can share your insights?
I have some
thoughts. In terms of privacy for users.
Yeah, as far as wisdom, I couldn't give you a guarantee. I just hope to be able to understand what I'm reading and thinking and discussing. I would say that there's a very interesting and very widespread already debate and work around policies of artificial intelligence ethics. And this is already starting in quite a few regions and nations to become regulations or drafts of legislation in order to identify the places where artificial intelligence or machine learning needs to be regulated in a way that minimizes risks. There's also augmented reality and virtual reality, who again have a promise to be very productive for humanity and benefit us, but also carries its own risks. And synthetic media, the stuff that makes potentially can make fake news. That's something we really need to think about quite heavily and see how we can work that out.
Fake news. I like that. We've heard a lot about fake news in the last 2 years or so. We'll come back to that maybe some other time. Thank you, Limor. That was terrific. I want to get to Brett Solomon now. Brett, before I begin, I would like to share one quote from your acting executive director at Access Now, Joseph Steele, during the 75th United Nations General Assembly. Quote, "We can't rely upon the next generation to fix the problems that we created. That responsibility lies with the generation that created the problems in the institutions that failed us." Could you please first point out the problems that you are dealing with, and maybe just give us a laundry list of some of the data policy issues experts are tracking right now?
Where do I start? And thanks to Limor for her comments, because I think that was a good kind of introduction to many of the issues that this generation is facing. I mean, I think a few things. One is that, we're really just at the beginning of the digital revolution. There's such a long way to go. And, as we've kind of already telegraphed, like, we don't necessarily know where it's going, and we don't necessarily know what the kind of regulatory environment that should be in place in order to ensure that the good stuff we keep and invest in, and the bad stuff we control and manage. When we talk about this generation, I think in a way we're kind of already into the second or maybe even into the third generation of new technologies. But the institutions that sort of have grown up contemporaneously are just, I think, ill-equipped, really. Like, when you look at the national bodies of pretty much all of the governments around the world, or you look at the international system, there isn't the proper speed, like there just isn't the capacity to move at the same time as the technology. I think many of the people who are sitting in the parliaments or in the judiciary are similarly, sort of out of touch in a way, or many of them are out of touch with the technologies that are being developed. So how do you regulate this if you don't even understand it? How do you regulate AI if you don't know what machine learning means? So there's a whole list of things before the decision makers, whether those decision makers are within states or within companies. And some of those issues I think Limor kind of mentioned, but what's on our agenda? We're very much focused on internet shutdowns. For instance, there was 155 internet shutdowns, which happened last year. So intentional disruptions of the network. And there's a whole body of work that's being done around that to try and keep the network open, even in times of protest or heightened political activity like elections, etc. We're also focused on the role of social media in conflict zones. So how social media used to incite violence, for instance, in the offline world? How has it been used as an incitement to genocide, as we've seen with the Rohingya in Myanmar, for instance, and also in elections, in the follow-up of elections? The issue of surveillance and biometrics is obviously very much at the top of the agenda, where a person's digital identity, their biometrics, their irises, their facial structure, the way that they walk, their voice, etc., is being collected by governments, but also by the private sector as well. And what does that mean in terms of one's ability to, live in public spaces? And I think at the center of it all, and again, it was also already mentioned, the issue around data protection as well. And like, how do we ensure that we have proper data protection, which is really at the center of all of these issues? We've seen the GDPR, which has emerged out of the European Union, but how does that get translated into other jurisdictions? And what do we think about data protection in the context of some of these new and emerging technologies?
So we're really only at the beginning of this digital revolution, you said. How long has this cycle to go?
It depends which cycle, it depends which cycle we're in. And that's the whole point. There's so many concentric cycles happening. The sort of, we run a conference called RightsCon. I think RightsCon is a really good example. Like the sort of the agenda of RightsCon tells you like what's hot in a way, like in terms of what, and maybe with Webbit as well, like, what's being discussed at the moment, like, 3 to 5 years ago, AI wasn't even on the agenda. I think digital identity wasn't there either. Now we're like right in the middle of that, where, you know, countries are passing digital identity laws, like in India, for instance, where there isn't really a proper data protection regulation in place. So, and then there are news cycles that are being kicked off all the time. Obviously, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's announcement of, you know, the metaverse or Meta and its relationship to the metaverse. I mean, that's kicked off another whole cycle. The problem for us is as civil society organizations and also for regulators is like, how do we keep up with the pace of this? And because we're, you know, the implications can be so real. We talk about, you know, autonomous weapons, for instance, like what, you know, that's a life and death issue. The issue around, you know, collection of health data is also a life and death issue as well. And yet, you know, we're just trying to like put a human rights agenda into all of these issues, making sure that expression, opinion, association, privacy, information, association, like all of these rights move into the digital environment. And that's the challenge that I think is before us. Yeah.
I mean, the actual regulation of digital rights that protects the individual citizen.
Mm-hmm. And you know, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's why it's important to have this discussion at this conference about the language of human rights. Like, I don't think we should be talking about ethics and values. I think we should be sticking to human rights. We have a set of precedents. We have, like, you know, decades of law. It's international law that's in place. Governments have signed up to it. Enforcement is the key now in the digital world, and making sure that those rights, those laws, those precedents are translated, because the individual is really the one that's at risk. You know, we have like 4.5 billion or so people who are online. Soon it's going to be the whole world within, you know, a couple of decades, probably. Everybody will be connected at some level. And so unless we protect rights in the digital environment, we're going to lose the gains that we've made in the offline world.
Well, that gets us to this whole notion and concept of the democratization of news. It's often referred to as citizen journalism. Speak to that if you could, because that's an area that has triggered an awful lot of debate in the West as regards rights and privacy and fake news and real news.
Well, you know, one of the great things is that citizen journalism basically gave everybody the opportunity to be able to communicate about their reality, about what was around them. You know, I remember when Access Now, my organization, was first started in 2009, like, you know, the only news that was coming out of Iran was from Fars news agency. And they were like, there's 100 people, you know, reporting, there's 100 people in the square protesting. We were like, we've just received a video and there's 100,000 people in the square, you know. And BBC and CNN were like, oh no, we can't receive that video. How do you authenticate it? How do you, you know, you prove that it's accurate, that it's from today, etc. And so we've learned now how to authenticate citizen media, but it's actually given a much fuller story or a more complete story, where everybody, now you look at every news item and there's like somebody with a camera and so on. So news itself is actually informed by citizen journalism. I think it's given us a much more holistic and complete understanding of the reality of people's worlds. But of course, there's a number of risks that are associated with that as well. And I think that this concept, we touched on the concept of fake news, which is obviously one of the big challenges that we're dealing with. And, you know, our concern is not so much with like so-called fake news, but the way in which governments are regulating so-called fake news, in the sense that they're using that as a shield and a cover to censor speech, right? So people are being punished, criminalized for so-called fake news that's inconsistent with the position of a government or an authority. Not to say that fake news isn't, you know, a real thing. Fake news isn't fake. There is real fake news. This could be a problematic sentence. Yeah. But anyway, point being is that, you know, it's going to get worse as well because of the Limor said about, you know, synthetic media or like, you know, deep fakes, where you actually can construct a reality. And I think we'll see that in the metaverse as well, where realities are constructed that aren't necessarily reflective of, you know, of truth.
Yeah, well, that's the whole regulation of all these platforms. You mentioned government and authorities. I mean, the authorities could be some of these social media platforms. We've seen how some of them have kicked off major voices, and yet will give a platform to an extremist radical group. They kicked off the president of the United States off Facebook. I mean, do you see any irony at that? Is that fair game? Is that a good development?
Yeah. So thanks for raising it. Look, the fact is that the state has traditionally been the primary duty bearer with respect to human rights, i.e. it is their determination as to what is legal or unlawful speech, what is lawful or unlawful association, etc. That onus has moved to the private sector now. And I think this is the challenge. One of the challenges that we face is that you end up in a situation where you have private actors, ill-trained in or not trained at all in human rights, making decisions about the legality or otherwise of content or the ability of a particular person to remain on the platform. Now, there's terms of service and there's community standards and so on. But they're often quite opaque. I think people don't necessarily understand how they operate. Certainly when we think about social media and you think about, Trump's deplatforming, I mean, Facebook and Twitter both have incitement to violence provisions within their community standards. I'm not saying that it's applied uniformly, but they believed, and so does their oversight board within Facebook, that there was there was incitement of violence that as a result of the speech of the president, that meant that the president should not have, the former president, should not be able to use the platform. And I think if we come back, there's a set of principles called the rebut principles, which basically look at a person in that position has a higher duty because of the reach, because of the status, because of the platform, because of the likelihood of people acting as a result of their speech. And I think that the rebut platform was properly applied in this instance. There's a lot of work still to do on this front, but I do think it was the appropriate decision.
Interesting answer, Brett. I mean, by that same standard, major figures on both the left and right could be kicked off, and eventually we'd have no voices on these platforms. People struggle with that idea. Yeah,
I mean, I think that we have 3.5 billion people that are using the platform, for example, Facebook, quite successfully. There is a very, we need to understand the difference. Speech is not all the same, right? There are different categories of speech, and incitement to violence, genocide, discrimination, and hatred is actually contrary to international law. It's not just a willy-nilly analysis that, it's actually contrary to international law. The second set of laws, which is laws which like hate speech and other forms of speech, they need to be actually codified in national jurisdictions. And I think that's then up to the state, but it needs to happen in a very, very, very limited sense. Limor mentioned the ideas of proportionality, legitimate aim, and necessity. And all of these things are essential when you're limiting speech. Like, as you say, this is a slippery slope to autocracy. It needs to be done in a very, very careful manner. It needs to be done beyond ideology, whether it be left or right.
Oh, thank you, Brett. Now I want to thank you for waiting patiently for us, Dr. Ruth. And you founded the Tara Health Foundation, whose mission is to support what is regarded as equality in domestic reproductive rights, global health, gender lens investing, as it is described, impact investing, and quote unquote, other women and girls initiatives and rights. My question, how, in your opinion, are these reproductive rights influencing society in general? And do reproductive rights matter in the end to the business community?
Thank you so much for the question. And it's an interesting topic to be included in a conversation about technology and human rights. And while I think the other panelists are looking at how can, as technologies are advancing, how can we safeguard human rights within those technologies? And in our case, we're looking at basic human rights and thinking about how can we look to technology to help advance the causes that we care about. And in the case of Tara Health Foundation, we're very interested in improving the lives of women and girls. And we recognize that reproductive rights and access to reproductive health care is really an essential component of how women can optimize both their social and economic positions in their families and in their cultures. In my career as an obstetrician and gynecologist, I recognize that women are really the center of their families and also the center of their local and national economies. And if we are able to make women's lives better and more equitable, we simultaneously fix most of the rest of the world's problems. And specifically, if we look at family planning, there's a direct correlation between women's ability to control the size of their families and their own economic and social optimization, and also the optimization of their families, their communities, and their governments. So I think there's a very clear connection.
So what are some of the challenges you face, and how does technology intersect with all of this today?
Well, we were very interested in how the markets, particularly the financial markets, are constrained when it comes to access to contraception and abortion care and maternal health care, that largely through stigma or artificial censorship, the markets don't behave the way they should, that there's not capital flowing to, for instance, commercialize development of new contraceptive technologies that are less expensive or more equitably available, or new platforms in order to access them, whether it's telemedicine or other things that technology certainly are capable of in other sectors, and they're way far behind when it comes to women's health. Abortion care is another example. It's a very simple procedure, and yet certainly in the United States and in many other countries around the world, there are layers of stigma and constraints that prevent care from being administered in a very easy way. The business should care about these things, because when we learned during the pandemic that women make up over 75% of the quote unquote essential workforce, whether it's in healthcare delivery or in the food chain and supply chains or the delivery systems more broadly, that when women are not healthy and able to participate fully in the workforce, and this certainly goes to things like equitable childcare and paid leave, things like that, that when women can't participate fully in the workforce, that it's actually a material risk to the companies they work for and to their communities.
I got to ask you, because you talked about the economic and business side of this, is abortion the answer to all our problems in the West? I mean, let's face it, we have a demographic time bomb. The West is losing population. We need more babies and children in the world. Do you get any pushback on that?
Certainly get pushback on access to abortion care. I haven't heard that particular pushback in a long time. So no. In terms of population growth, I don't think that that's the place where people disagree about abortion. The ability to control one's family size is a universal human right. And of course, there are incentives that can be given to families if a country or society wants more babies to be born. There are ways to reward families for that and to give them incentives. And there's also certainly opportunities to consider what drives people to want to end a pregnancy and make it easier for them to continue a pregnancy if that's what's perceived as being good for the society. But in terms of the global human rights conversation, women need to be able to, and families need to be able to control when and how they have children, and whether it's through contraception or abortion or having healthy pregnancies if they choose to have pregnancies, or be well supported after their pregnancies and they're raising their children. Those are all things that are essential human rights that we should be looking for technological opportunities to optimize those things.
Well, I'm glad we've had this opportunity, Dr. Ruth, to have this debate, and it's important that we talk about it and agree to disagree even. I mean, you mentioned that it's a universal human right, but abortion is illegal in some countries in this world because the citizens of those nations believe in the right to life of the child. How do you react to that? Does the child in the womb have a right?
You know, I don't know that that's
the topic of this conversation. Is that the topic of this panel, with all due respect? I mean, I think I don't think we're necessarily, I would hope not be talking about the sort of whether abortion should or shouldn't be. It's fine. I mean, Ruth, I agree with everything you've said, and thank you so much for being so eloquent. I think the issue here, if I may, is about the intersection with a woman's right to choose, or with healthcare, which includes abortion, and technology. And I think there's a very interesting and important discussion to be had on that front, rather than to determine whether the population size should be connected with a woman's decision to, terminate a pregnancy.
I appreciate your jumping in, Brett. And I think that within societies and within governments that make decisions about what are what are legal medical care, you can extend this to thinking about end of life decisions or gender reassignment surgeries. I mean, there are lots of places where governments make decisions and medical systems make decisions about what are ethical treatments. And of course, abortion is something that in many cultures in our world, it's not an accepted practice. So I don't mean to oversimplify, but there are also, most governments actually do allow for abortion. And yet, even in the countries like the United States, many in Africa and Europe, where abortion is legal and accepted, there are so many artificial constraints to the markets and a lack of innovation and lack of technology to allow for these very simple procedures to be done. And so the argument is not so much around the ethicality of abortion right now, it's how can technology advance something that is so important to society, so important to women, so important to business, and really, think about what the human rights aspect of application of technologies.
Yeah, no, I just back to your point, Brett, your comment, sure, but we're talking about the democratization of news, and we have to see it from both sides. We see this pushback here in the United States and in the West, and people who are providers and run organizations have to answer these and address them in the boardroom. So if we ignore them, then that creates another set of challenges.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you see the future for your mission, Dr. Ruth? Where are you expanding globally? Are you deploying new technologies now that we are talking about technologies? Can you lay that out for us a little bit?
I'm a systems thinker, and this comes from my background in medicine, and how do you apply evidence and research to change whole systems of care? And it's something that's evolved quite a bit in the last 3 decades in medicine, and how we've gone from really a craft and providing individual care to how do you take care of whole populations of people. And I think there's opportunities to do that across many different fields, and particularly in my interest in philanthropy and impact investing, that we need to apply a broader systems approach to the solutions. And ultimately, if we don't look at things more holistically, the problems are never actually going to go away. Philanthropy and a lot of the development work that goes on around the world is really just a Band-Aid. It doesn't change the system that caused the problems to begin with. So I'm very interested in how the markets and the financial markets can redirect capital across all asset classes and transform things. In particular, I think that there's opportunities to for women to be more in control of financial decision making. We know that women actually tend to make more money, whether it's as CEOs or board directors or entrepreneurs or venture capital fund directors, that if we can bring the financial decision making across the planet more into the hands of women, we will see not only better returns for investors, but also better social outcomes. So those are the kinds of systems thinking ideas that I'm working to promote.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ruth. I want all the three panelists now to look at the crystal ball, at your own crystal ball, and maybe project out 10 years what you see coming in your respective sectors in terms of privacy rights, technology, and the whole issue of human rights. Limor, do you want to come in first here?
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on the previous discussion, just to add that I've recently seen in Israel more and more discussion under the Startup Nation umbrella that we have here in this small country around femtech, which is the technologies that are meant to assist in the democratization of women's health. And I've spoken with quite a few startups that are working on very interesting solutions for that. So I think that it really is a promising vertical of development. Looking, well, not looking at the future, but trying to look back at the beginning of the internet, the history of the internet. I think one of the main things that was a characteristic of the internet is the possibility or the promise of anonymity, and the fact that people could be completely anonymous, especially in the early days. And I think that looking forward or moving forward into our near future, we already have less and less anonymity online, and with the current state of risks and harms that the web holds, I think that we will see more and more identification connected to our acts and to our various social activities online, and less anonymity. I think one of the best things about being able to be anonymous was freedom of speech and the support to be able to express yourself quite freely. But that also has shown us over the years that it entails also harms to others, and less ability of governments to enforce laws and to promote human rights online. So I think that we will see less and less anonymity, more and more identity connected with our various online activities. And whether that's good or bad, I wouldn't be able to say, but I think that's happening already.
So Brett, what is in the crystal ball at Access Now?
Yeah, I mean, Limor, we should definitely have a conversation after this panel because, you know, I was going to say a similar thing. Maybe we're looking at the same crystal ball from a similar angle even. I think this issue around digital identity is really, there's going to be already started to be the entry point into the digital economy and into digital society. Your biometrics are unchangeable, and it's not just about you, it's actually about your unborn children and your grandchildren and so on. Like, your identity, your DNA actually replicates, and so what does that mean for all of the rights in terms of when you connect your digital identity together with your geolocation, together with your your online practices, together with with brain technology, with your thoughts and so on? Like, what happens to human autonomy? And I think that we are heading very fast down a direction. We also talked about, democratization. Does technology lead to democratization, or does it lead to, autocracy and total control? And in a way, technology is shaping up through digital identity and biometrics to being the building block of, the authoritarian state. I don't want to leave on a negative, because I think that there's also lots of positives as well that are emerging. I can't wait till the whole world is connected. Not necessarily that they're all connected, but the world can actually have a decision, a choice whether they wish to be connected. And I think that's the missing piece.
I mean, I get net technology is a beautiful, wonderful thing. I mean, if we didn't have it, we'd be back in the dark ages. Let's be real. People, there's this pushback on technology, but we have to do it in a very healthy way that is good for society.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's right. And I think what's important in that is that the folks who are the most impacted by those technologies are able to have a seat at the table to decide how those technologies are deployed, how they're policed, how they're advanced and utilized. And that's one of the things I hope for as our technology advances, that in the expansion, that we understand more fully who it is that needs a seat at the table to set these standards and help us measure whether or not we're getting the outcomes we really want.
I guess one final concluding thought is that the ordinary citizen who's not, tech savvy, for example, that's pretty the mass of the population, feel very remote, for example, from Silicon Valley and from the tech giants. I think it has instilled this great, I won't call it an existential crisis, but we have to connect it to ordinary people. And there's also a generational divide, of course. You mentioned how it was accelerating, Brett. We don't have a lot of time, but maybe the ordinary person on the street, we spoke about fearing and welcoming technology, but not everybody does.
No, absolutely. I think this is a question of internet governance, of technology governance, and who is making the decisions, on what basis, according to consultations with which groups. I think the affected user is obviously the starting point, and at the moment, many of those decisions are being made in boardrooms or in parliaments and congresses without the input of the ordinary citizen. So, yeah.
Anybody want to come in here real quickly before we conclude and wrap up? Oh, I guess we're out of time.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Thank you all.